Buddha's two teachers, mystery, why he couldn't get enlightened, the Jhāna secret. A lot of what we experience in life, our sense of ourselves, our sense of the world around us, comes from our own construction, the things we put together. You might say that the present moment is a construction site. We're cobbling things together, and they fall apart. We cobble them together again. When we're engaged in this activity, we really feel secure because it's so familiar to us. But part of us knows that it's pretty rickety. It can change at any time, which is why we're constantly at it. When we come to concentration, we're going to take some of that apart. For instance, our fabrication around sensuality. All our thoughts and plans and everything, when we sit down with the breath, have to go by the wayside. And for a lot of us, that's a lot of our identity. That and the pleasure we take in those things. So we feel a little bit out of our element. But if you can stick with the breath long enough and have a sense of well-being with the breath, you begin to see that this is actually very pleasant. The pleasures you got from sensuality don't seem so important anymore. At least for the time being, they don't seem necessary. Some people find it easier to drop them than others. This is something that happens through all the different stages of concentration. Some people slip very easily from one level to the next, while others find that it's pretty wrenching and threatening because there's some aspect of the way they construct things that they are very attached to. You see this as you move from the first jhana, where you're talking to yourself basically about the breath, about how things are going, into the second, where you stop talking. Some people have a very strong sense that that's who they are, the speaker in the mind, commenting on things, and just being with the perception. Just the one word. Instead of speaking in sentences and questions, you're just saying that one word over and over, breath, 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 and focusing on one sensation can seem a little threatening, a little difficult. But if you can convince yourself that this is what the mind can do, and it will have a good effect, that's when you get that quality the Buddha calls internal assurance. You're okay with just that one perception. It's as if you've been walking along a street and all of a sudden you find yourself on a tightrope. It's just that one perception, that one little line carrying you through, and you need some self-assurance to stay with it. Now, it does help that while holding that one line, you do create a sense of well-being in the body. Sometimes you actually have the sensation described in the analogies for the second jhana, which is that there's an upwelling of energy in the torso. The blood is flowing freely. It feels good, and you don't have to do anything. Lessons from Jhāna. In the image of the first jhana, there's the bathman who's working the water through the soap dough, mixing everything just right. That corresponds to the activity of directed thought and evaluation, where you're getting the breath comfortable and you're allowing that sense of comfortable breath to permeate the body. Working it through the different breath channels, working it through the blockages in the different parts of the body, you're actively doing something there. But as you move into the next level of jhana, you're not doing anything. It's happening on its own. All the channels are opened up and you feel refreshed. Another issue of moving from the first to the second jhana is simply the question of when the mind is ready to do this. Sometimes you work and work and work with the breath energies, and they just don't seem to be working well. There seem to be some blockages that you just can't get past. Tell yourself, well, live with them. Settle down. See if you can hold on to this one perception. Sometimes this act of moving into this one perception opens up some of the blockages. Things were kept tight and tense because you were talking to yourself. But if you can move to that sense of, instead of talking in sentences, just repeating that one word or that one perception, breath. Holding to one image, say, of breath, see what that does. Maybe it opens things up. Another issue some people have is with the feeling of rapture. sometimes a sense of energy moving through the body gets overwhelming. And here again, some people find it very easy and enjoyable, and other people really don't like it. It's a matter of what you're used to and what you identify with. When it starts moving, sometimes it gets stuck here or there. This can happen especially with people who are used to having to suppress their emotions, trying to keep them under control. All this excess energy suddenly seems threatening. Or if they have certain blockages and suddenly there's pressure that builds up against the blockage, it gets uncomfortable. This is why Ajahn Lee has you work through the whole body from the very beginning of the meditation, opening up all the different channels so that when there's a release of energy, it doesn't get blocked. It flows through the body. It feels okay. As for people who have had an experience of almost drowning, sometimes this sensation of fullness in the body feels threatening because it reminds them of the time they almost died. In that case, they have to hold in mind the perception that they're surrounded by air, surrounded by space. There's no water pressing in on them. The fullness is purely an internal sensation. They're not being oppressed. They're not being stifled. But again, it's a matter of what ways of fabricating your experience of the present moment you really hold on to, which ones you identify with very strongly, and which ones you don't. If it's something you identify with strongly, it's going to be hard to let go of. It takes a while to develop the confidence to tell yourself, yes, I can let this go, and I'll be okay. Similarly, as you move to the third jhana, there comes a point when that excess energy just gets really too much. You have to be confident that you don't have to rein it in. You can simply let it evaporate. All you have to do is move your attention to a subtler level of energy in the body, and it's there. It's like tuning your radio to a different radio station. You'd been listening to heavy metal and now you move to something soothing that's also been broadcasting all along, just that you weren't previously tuned to it. It gives you a sense of ease, very light, very peaceful. The movement of rapture is gone, and there's just a very subtle breath. The move to the next jhana can also seem threatening when you actually stop breathing. You might be in a state like this for a while and suddenly realize, wait a minute, there's no breath. And you can panic. You can think, whoops, I'm going to die. You're holding on to the perception that you've got to keep pumping the breath in, pumping the breath in. Here again, you have to train yourself. It is possible to be here once the breath energy fills the body and all the breath channels feel connected and not have to breathe. How this is explained in terms of physiology, I can't really say. Some people say that there's oxygen exchange at the skin. Other people say that there's none. But it is possible to sit here and not have to breathe in and out. That's what you know when you're here. When the breath energy fills the body, you don't feel any need to breathe. The only felt need is the mind's preconception about what's got to be done. If the body does need to breathe, it'll breathe on its own. You don't have to worry. The movement from that state into the dimension of space can also be threatening or difficult for some people. They realize that yes, the body is here, but they're going to ignore all the perceptions, all the sensations that tell them where the skin is, where the line is between your body and what's outside the body. They feel a little unstable holding on to that perception of space permeating the body, permeating everything outside. Here again, some people really like that. Other people feel unstable at first, so you have to look into it. Where are you holding on? Some of these states require a very precise focus on exactly what perception you're going to hold on to and which perceptions you're going to let go. There is a part of the mind that realizes, okay, I could leave this perception at any time and hold on to other perceptions. So it seems rather arbitrary. Why stay here? Well, the answer is that if you stay here, you learn something interesting about the mind that you wouldn't learn otherwise. If you flit from perception to perception randomly, there's not that much that's learned. But when you hold on to one perception, whether it's simply the perception of the breath, the perception of the body not having to breathe, the perception of the boundary between the body and the space outside dissolving away. These are useful perceptions because they give you a chance to look at the way you fabricate your experience. And you're letting go of different aggregates. You're letting go of fabrication, stage by stage. You're letting go of certain perceptions. You're letting go of certain feelings. And you're letting go of the sense of the body. You can even work up to where you let go of your sense of the oneness of your consciousness. That happens when you move from the dimension of the infinitude of consciousness to the dimension of nothingness. The sense of the oneness of the knower, you drop it. Now that sense of oneness is what's been holding you together in concentration all along. So letting it go is going to be threatening. But if you have an explorer's attitude, that you're trying to figure out how you put things together and which of those activities you can put aside, it can be fascinating. An aspect that's really pleasant about this is that you've been engaging in lots of different activities, and it takes a lot of energy. And here, you can learn how to let some of the things go and yet not just wander around. You can stay still, but you have to let go of your fabrications very systematically. It's like playing pickup sticks. You pull out this stick and you pull out that stick, careful to pull just the right stick, hoping that you're not going to collapse the whole thing. And you find that you can gain a sense of great stability even without all that extra activities. This is one of the ways in which the practice of right concentration really opens up things in your mind. You begin to see, oh, I've been doing this, doing that all along, and now I have the choice to do it or not. I don't have to identify with it, telling myself that without it, I won't be able to live, that I won't be able to survive without this perception or that way of fabricating things. It helps to lighten the burdens of the mind. At the same time, you gain some understanding as to how all this is put together, realizing that the lessons you learn also help to explain a question that often comes up when we read the life story of the Buddha. He studied with two teachers who taught him the dimension of nothingness and the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception, and he realized that neither of those counted as the goal. So he left, subjecting himself to self-torture for 6 years. Then he realized that that wasn't the path, so he cast his mind around and asked, could there be another path? He thought of a time when he was a child and had entered spontaneously into the first jhana. Well, the question often arises, wasn't he doing the first jhana under those two teachers? And don't some passages in the canon say that you can gain awakening based on the dimension of nothingness or the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception? So why couldn't he just go there, back to those old attainments, and gain awakening from there? And the answer, I think, lies in the fact that you can get into those very refined states in different ways. There is one sutta where the Buddha identifies 3 ways you can get to the dimension of nothingness, and a way you can get to the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. And of those 3 ways, only one involves the insights that come from putting the mind through this step-by-step practice of going through the first through the 4th jhanas, and then going through the dimension of space and the dimension of consciousness. The fact that you've arrived at the dimension of nothingness having gone through those stages, taking them apart, primes you to see things in terms of the different kinds of fabrication, the aggregates or the types of fabrication listed in dependent co-arising. Whereas the 2 other ways that you can get into the dimension of nothingness are simply by repeating a mantra. The 2 mantras the Buddha gives basically comes down to, there is no self, there's nothing of me, nothing of mine. By holding that perception in mind, you can get into the state of nothingness without passing through the other levels of jhana, and you haven't gained insight into the different ways of fabrication. Similarly, with the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception, you can tell yourself, nothing will occur to me. I'll think of nothing at all, either inside or out, and you can get yourself into that dimension. But then you hold on to it. That's what prevents it from being awakening. there's still the possibility of clinging in there. You're clinging to the feeling of equanimity that comes up. Again, you cling because you haven't really learned how to take your mind apart or taken fabrications apart. You've just badgered it into that state. So it's good when you're getting the mind into concentration that you realize that there is right concentration that can help you understand the mind. And there are other kinds of concentration that don't teach those lessons. So remember, we're here to learn about fabrication, the way we put things together, and it's possible to feel threatened by the different ways of dropping some of those fabrications. Well, very carefully coax yourself and remind yourself that it's okay, and prepare yourself properly. Ajahn Lee's instructions for breath are really good that way. You open up the breath energy channels so that if any excess energy comes along, you can release it. It's not all bottled up. And you begin to get a sense that all the activities that you're doing to put things together and then see them fall apart, so you put them together again and see them fall apart. You can begin to drop those activities. You can have your choice as to when to engage in them and when not. You become more a master of your own mind. This way, you can go through life with a lot more lightness. Otherwise, we burden ourselves immensely by the things we hold on to. We think that by holding on to them, they're going to save us. But instead, they pull us down. So if you learn how to let go in the right way and get a sense of confidence that, yes, the mind can be perfectly fine not engaging, say, in all the sensual fantasies it used to do, or dropping a lot of its internal chatter, or even getting to the point where you can stop breathing, it increases your sense of what's possible. It gives rise to a lot more understanding and lifts a lot of burdens off your back. Thinking about Jhāna, Ajahn Fuang, my primary teacher, once said that people coming to the practice of concentration fall into two types: those who think too much and those who don't think enough. This, of course, raises the question of how much thinking in the context of concentration is just right. This question requires a clear answer, because there are many ways in which the mind can be concentrated, anywhere from those in which the concentration consists totally of thinking to those in which the mind is so forcefully and narrowly focused that all sense of the body and of the five senses is blotted out and in which it's impossible to think. When we look into the suttas or discourses of the Pali Canon, the earliest extant record of the Buddha's teachings, we find that the Buddha's discussions of the four jhanas, his standard definition of right concentration, recommend a middle way between these two extremes. However, the just rightness of the practice of jhana is not only a matter of how much you think, but also of what you think about, how you think, and when. The suttas' descriptions of the role of thinking in concentration practice fall into four stages of practice. 1. Thinking prior to jhana. 2. Thinking in the first jhana. 3. Mental activity in the remaining jhanas. And 4. The mental activity of discernment based on the jhanas. These stages are demarcated mainly by questions of vocabulary focused on two sets of words. The first set consists of the word jhana itself, along with its accompanying verb, jayati. The second set consists of the general Pali word for thinking, vitakka, the word for evaluation, vikara, which is often paired with vitakka, and their accompanying verbs, vitakati, vikarati, anuvitaketi, and anuvikarati. In the context of the four stages just mentioned, jhana applies directly only to stages 2 and 3, although the fourth stage can be practiced while you're in jhana. As for vitakka and vikara, they're used only in the first two stages. Jhana. Unfortunately, what these two words mean in these stages has provoked controversy. So before we can go into detail about how they function in the 4 stages of the practice, we have to resolve the controversies around both of them. The best way to resolve the controversy around the word jhana is to start by quoting the standard sutta passages describing the 4 jhanas, and then the standard list of similes that expand on that description. There is the case where a monk, quite secluded from sensuality, secluded from unskillful dhammas, enters and remains in the first jhana, rapture and pleasure, born of seclusion, accompanied by vitakka and vikara. With the stilling of vitakas and vikaras, he enters and remains in the second jhana, rapture and pleasure born of concentration, unification of awareness free from vitakka and vikara, internal assurance. With the fading of rapture, he remains equanimous, mindful, and alert, and senses pleasure with the body. He enters and remains in the third jhana, of which the noble ones declare, equanimous and mindful, he has a pleasant abiding. With the abandoning of pleasure and pain, as with the earlier disappearance of elation and distress, he enters and remains in the fourth jhana, purity of equanimity and mindfulness, neither pleasure nor pain. SN 45:8. As for the similes, the first jhana, just as if a dexterous bathman or bathman's apprentice would pour bath powder into a brass basin and knead it together, sprinkling it again and again with water, so that his ball of bath powder, saturated, moisture-laden, permeated within and without, would nevertheless not drip. In the same way, the monk permeates and pervades, suffuses, and fills this very body with the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. There is nothing of his entire body unpervaded by rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. The second jhana, just like a lake with spring water welling up from within, having no inflow from the east, west, north, or south, and with the skies supplying abundant showers time and again, so that the cool fount of water welling up from within the lake would permeate and pervade, suffuse and fill it with cool waters, there being no part of the lake unpervaded by the cool waters. In the same way, the monk permeates and pervades, suffuses and fills this very body with the rapture and pleasure born of concentration. There is nothing of his entire body unpervaded by rapture and pleasure born of concentration. The third jhana. Just as in a lotus pond, some of the lotuses, born and growing in the water, stay immersed in the water and flourish without standing up out of the water, so that they are permeated and pervaded, suffused and filled with cool water from their roots to their tips, and nothing of those lotuses would be unpervaded with cool water. In the same way, the monk permeates and pervades, suffuses and fills this very body with the pleasure divested of rapture. There is nothing of his entire body unpervaded with pleasure divested of rapture. The fourth jhana. Just as if a man were sitting covered from head to foot with a white cloth, so that there would be no part of his body to which the white cloth did not extend. In the same way, the monk sits, permeating the body with a pure, bright awareness. There is nothing of his entire body unpervaded by pure, bright awareness. DN2. The word jhana is usually translated as absorption, and although it's mainly used in the suttas to denote the 4 jhanas of right concentration, MN 108 shows that it can also be applied to excessive absorption in unskillful thoughts of sensual passion, ill will, sloth and drowsiness, restlessness and anxiety, and doubt, what are called the 5 hindrances. The excessive and absorbing nature of this thinking is indicated by the way the relevant passage in MN 108 plays with the verbs that describe it. It wasn't the case, Brahman, that the Blessed One praised mental absorption, jhana, of every sort, nor did he criticize mental absorption of every sort. And what sort of mental absorption did he not praise? There is the case where a certain person dwells with his awareness overcome by sensual passion, seized with sensual passion. He does not discern the escape, as it has come to be, from sensual passion once it has arisen. Making that sensual passion the focal point, he absorbs himself with it, besorbs, resorbs, and supersorbs, jayati pajayati nijayati apajayati himself with it. Similarly with the remaining hindrances. MN 108. The long-standing habit of translating jhana as absorption has been called into question, largely because the verb jayati is often translated in a more generic way as meditate. From this, it's been argued that because the verb has a generic meaning, the noun should too. From that, it's been further argued that because the suttas devote more space to the practice of using thought to abandon unskillful qualities and to develop skillful qualities than it does to absorptive practices like mindfulness of breathing, that kind of thought most deserves to be called right concentration. In fact, absorptive practices, devoid of thought, would get in the way of the skillful use of thought, so they should be excluded from the definition of jhana. Therefore, the jhanas must not involve absorption in physical sensations, as is commonly believed. In other words, this argument defines the word jhana in a way to be more inclusive, but then uses the newly included inductees to expel the practices more traditionally associated with jhana. X must include not only Y but also Z, but then, because Z, which is more numerous, is included in X, Y has to be thrown out. But even if we ignore the argument's weak logic, we can note that its starting point, the persistent habit of translating jayati as meditate, is itself questionable. There's nothing in the suttas to indicate that jayati, used in a positive sense in the context of meditation, means anything other than specifically do jhana. The habit of translating it in a more generic sense as meditate came from the post-canonical belief, unsupported in the suttas, that it's possible to attain awakening without having attained any of the four jhanas. So when the Buddha pointed to the roots of trees and told the monks jayatha, the plural imperative form of the verb, he was telling them explicitly to do jhana there. Second, even though the suttas do devote a lot of space to the practice of using thought to abandon unskillful qualities and to develop skillful qualities, that doesn't mean that such a practice should be called jhana. The actual fact of the matter, as we will see, is that the suttas describe this practice as a step prior to jhana, DN2, AN 1099, and not as jhana itself. Third, as we will see below, MN 44 defines the themes of concentration as the four establishings of mindfulness. In other words, right concentration is focused on the activity of right mindfulness. In fact, the descriptions of right mindfulness show how to get the mind into right concentration. This is why right mindfulness precedes right concentration in the factors of the path. Now, the extended descriptions of right mindfulness in MN10 and DN22 start with the first four steps of mindfulness of breathing, which SN 54.8 indicates is both a mindfulness and a concentration practice. This means that the suttas' descriptions of how to get the mind into jhana actually start with mindfulness of breathing, so that practice shouldn't be excluded from the definition of jhana. Fourth, and most graphically, the fact that doing jhana would involve not just thinking, but actual absorption in physical and mental sensations is shown in the similes we've quoted above. The meditator is said to pervade the body with feelings of pleasure to the point where, in the third jhana, nothing in the body is unpervaded, and then moving on to a state in which the body is filled with a pure, bright awareness. It's hard to interpret this simply as a process of thinking and not to see it as a state of full-body absorption in bodily and mental sensations. What's more, the suttas frequently describe the fourth jhana, as the basis for developing such psychic powers as the ability to read minds and to recollect past lifetimes. This would be impossible if the fourth jhana were simply a thinking process of abandoning unskillful qualities and developing skillful ones. But it would be entirely possible that these psychic powers could develop from a still, full-body awareness. For these reasons, absorption still seems to be the best English translation for jhana. Vitakka and Vikara. As for Vitakka and Vikara, in the Suta's descriptions of the stage prior to jhana, these terms can refer either to skillful thinking and evaluating or to unskillful thinking and evaluating. In the first jhana, though, the Vitakka and Vikara that act as component factors of the jhana are exclusively skillful. The controversy here is over whether Vitakka and Vikara mean the same thing both prior to jhana and in the first jhana. It has been argued that Vitakka and Vikara in the first jhana cannot mean thinking and evaluating, and that instead they have a technical meaning totally divorced from thinking and evaluating. But here again, the fundamental basis for this argument is extrinsic to the suttas. There are states of concentration so one-pointed and oblivious to the body that they make thinking impossible. From this fact, the argument states that they, and they alone, should be identified with the four jhanas. But nothing in the suttas indicates that this is so. To begin with, the standard similes indicate that the jhanas are states of full-body awareness. But here there's a counter-argument that body in the similes doesn't mean the physical body, but a mental body, because the physical body cannot be perceived while you're in jhana. But if that were the case, why would the Buddha have used the similes to begin with? He would have described jhana by using similes of narrow single-pointedness and darkness, avoiding mention of the body altogether so as not to confuse people, rather than using similes of brightness, expansion, and full-body sensations. In either instance, his use of the terms vitakka and vikara in the description of the first jhana, and his use of the term body in the similes, if he had meant for these terms to have special meanings in the context of jhana, he would have said so. But he never does. In fact, the opposite is the case. In MN 19, he describes the first and second stages of the practice, using the word vitakka to describe thinking prior to jhana, and then continuing to use the same word in the context of the first jhana. Had he meant the word to have a different meaning when changing the context, he would have said so. But he doesn't. Similarly, in MN 119, where he uses the word body when describing mindfulness immersed in the body, obviously meaning the physical body, and then he proceeds to use the same word in the similes for the jhanas. If he had meant it to have a different meaning in the second context, he would have said so. But again, he doesn't. So given that the one-pointed oblivious definition of jhana requires that the Buddha was either devious or incompetent in his teachings, using body to mean not body and thinking to mean not thinking, we have to reject that definition of what jhana entails. In other words, we have to assume that vitakka and vikara have the same meaning both in the first jhana and in the stage prior to it. This means that the difference between the first jhana and the stage prior to it is not a matter of thinking and not thinking. As we'll see, it's more a matter of what you're thinking about and why. Stage 1. Prior to jhana. The standard description of the first jhana says that it begins when you're secluded or withdrawn from sensuality and from unskillful mental qualities. So the duty of mental activity in the stage of the practice prior to the first jhana is to rid the mind of these activities. Different passages in the suttas define these unskillful mental activities in slightly different ways. And 663 defines sensuality as passion for one's resolves for sensual pleasures. In other words, it means not the sensual pleasures themselves, but your fascination with thinking about them. SM 4522 defines unskillful mental qualities, dhammas, as the factors of the eightfold wrong path, from wrong view through wrong concentration. DN2, which treats the stages of practice, describes this stage of secluding the mind as the act of getting rid of hindrances. MN19 describes it as getting rid of thoughts, vitakka, related to wrong resolve, thoughts of sensuality, thoughts of ill will, and thoughts of harmfulness. Of these passages, MN19 is most explicit in describing what kind of mental activity this stage entails. It falls basically into two sorts. The first involves replacing unskillful thoughts with their opposite skillful thoughts, vitakka, thoughts of renunciation, thoughts of non-ill will, and thoughts of harmlessness. The verbs used here are anuvitaketi and anuvikareti. You keep thinking and evaluating these skillful themes. The second sort of activity involves acts of metacognition, in which you step back from your thinking, observe it, and decide whether it's worth doing. In the context of the Buddha's instructions for meditation, the purpose of metacognition is basically to develop dispassion for the mental processes you're observing. In other words, the metacognition is aimed at arriving at the conclusion that no, they're not worth the effort that goes into them, and are best abandoned. The verbs used in this case are not anuvitaketi or anuvikarati. Instead, they're pajanati, to discern, patisanchikati, to notice, reflect, or consider, pakavikati, to reflect or examine, and samanupasati, to regard or to envision. Although these verbs may be used to describe both skillful and unskillful mental activities outside of the practice of meditation, they're used within that practice exclusively to describe skillful mental activities aimed at inducing dispassion. Note that these verbs do not indicate bare awareness or bare attention. Instead, you reflect on skillful and unskillful thinking as actions. You discern that they lead to consequences, you envision the long-term consequences, and then you judge whether they're worth pursuing based on the consequences you see and anticipate. Although this sort of metacognition does involve a type of thinking and evaluating, the Buddha never used the terms vitakka or vikara to describe it. Apparently, he wanted to indicate that meditative metacognition involved mental activity of a special sort. Thinking, vitakka, imbued with sensuality arose in me. I discerned, payanami, that thinking imbued with sensuality has arisen in me, and that leads to my own affliction, or to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both. It obstructs discernment, promotes vexation, and doesn't lead to unbinding. When I had noticed patisanchikato, that it leads to my own affliction, it subsided. When I had noticed that it leads to the affliction of others, to the affliction of both, it obstructs discernment, promotes vexation, and doesn't lead to unbinding, it subsided. Whenever thinking imbued with sensuality had arisen, I simply abandoned it, destroyed it, dispelled it, wiped it out of existence. Similarly, with thoughts of ill will and harmfulness. MN 19. Two things are worth noticing in this step of the practice. First, one of the drawbacks that the Buddha discerned about unskillful thinking is that it leads to the affliction of others. In other words, it would lead him to act in ways that would harm them. The fact that he saw this as a drawback meant that he was concerned not only with the state of his own mind, but also with the impact of his actions on others. In this way, his contemplation had a moral dimension, which explains why right speech, right action, and right livelihood function as necessary parts of the path. Only if your actions truly avoid afflicting others can you say that you've definitely set unskillful thinking aside. The second point worth noticing is that the Buddha, while seeing the rewards of skillful thinking, saw that it too had its drawbacks. And as I remained thus heedful, ardent, and resolute, thinking, vitakka, imbued with renunciation, arose in me. I discerned, pajanami, that thinking imbued with renunciation has arisen in me, and that leads neither to my own affliction, nor to the affliction of others, nor to the affliction of both. It fosters discernment, promotes lack of vexation, and leads to unbinding. If I were to keep thinking and evaluating, anuvitaketi anuvikareti, in line with that even for a night, even for a day and night, I do not envision samanupasami, any danger that would come from it, except that thinking and evaluating a long time would tire the body. When the body is tired, the mind is disturbed, and a disturbed mind is far from concentration. So I steadied my mind right within, settled, unified, and concentrated it. Why is that? So that my mind would not be disturbed. Similarly, with thoughts of non-ill will and harmlessness. Men 19. This passage provides one of the reasons why you as a meditator would want to go beyond even skillful vitakka. You want to reach a state in which the body is not tired and the mind is undisturbed. In other words, resting the mind from thought doesn't get in the way of skillful thought. It gives the mind a chance to rest and to gather its strength, as we will see below, for more precise discernment. As DN2 explains, the fact that you're able to get past the hindrances calms the body and gives rise to a sense of joy, gladness, and rapture, all of which are conducive to getting the mind into jhāna. MN19 adds that the fact that you've eliminated unskillful thinking puts the mind in a state where its mindfulness is unmuddled. It's in this way that skillful thinking and metacognition can prepare the mind for an alert state of concentration in which it doesn't have to think. But as the description of the first jhana indicates, there is still some more thinking that has to be done before the mind can attain a state where vitakka and vikara can be totally dropped. Although, with one possible exception, the verbs used to indicate metacognition, to discern, to reflect, to regard, don't appear in any of the descriptions of pure jhana practice in the second and third stages of the practice. They will reappear in the fourth stage, where the meditator reflects on the drawbacks of jhana. Vitakka and vikara, however, still appear in descriptions of the second stage of the practice, the first jhana, only to disappear from descriptions of the remaining two stages. Stage 2, the first jhana. Two questions then arise. What kind of thinking and evaluating occur in the first jhana, and what purpose do they serve? The suttas don't provide direct, explicit answers to these questions, but they do state in an indirect way that the thinking and evaluating are focused on the topic or theme, nimitta, of the jhana itself, and that their purpose is to maximize the pleasure and rapture that can be derived from focusing on that theme. MN44 defines concentration as singleness of mind, chittasakagata, literally one gathering placeness of mind, eka, one and one, aga, one gathering place, ta, one ness. This suggests that the activity of vitakka and vikara have to stay within the bounds of the one object of the first jhana. Otherwise, the mind wouldn't be gathered in or around one place. As we noted above, MN44 also states that the themes of concentration, and here it must be speaking of right concentration, are the four establishings of mindfulness. These are defined in SN 45-8 as follows. And what, monks, is right mindfulness? There is the case where a monk remains focused on the body in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, subduing greed and distress with reference to the world. He remains focused on feelings in and of themselves, ardent, alert, and mindful, having subdued greed and distress with reference to the world. He remains focused on the mind in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, subduing greed and distress with reference to the world. He remains focused on mental qualities in and of themselves, ardent, alert, and mindful, having subdued greed and distress with reference to the world. This, monks, is called right mindfulness. And 870 expands on this point, showing how the practice of right mindfulness leads directly to the practice of the four jhanas, although it inserts an extra step between the first jhana and the second, in which there's no vitakka and a modicum of vikara. None of the suttas expand on what this would mean. You should then train yourself thus. I will remain focused on the body in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, having subdued greed and distress with reference to the world. That's how you should train yourself. When you have developed this concentration in this way, you should develop this concentration with vitakka and vikara. You should develop it with no vitakka and a modicum of vikara. You should develop it with no vitakka and no vikara. You should develop it accompanied by rapture, not accompanied by rapture. Endowed with a sense of enjoyment. You should develop it endowed with equanimity, similarly with the other establishings of mindfulness. And 870. Curiously, the suttas provide detailed instructions for how to develop concentration using only one of the four frames of reference on which mindfulness is established, the body. However, the suttas' most detailed instructions on how to focus on the body take the breath as their object, and they make the point that if you follow their instructions on how to focus on the breath, you at the same time establish mindfulness in the remaining three frames of reference as well. MN 118, SN 5413. The direct connection between right mindfulness and right concentration is shown in an interesting passage in MN 125, where the Buddha compares the training of a monk to the training of a wild elephant. The sutta lists the same steps for the monk's training set forth in other suttas that provide similar maps of the practice, such as DN2 and AN 1099, but with an important difference. In the spot where the other suttas place the practice of the first jhana, this sutta mentions training in the four establishings of mindfulness. But its treatment of these establishings shows that when they are successfully mastered, they're equivalent to the first jhana. It also gives an important clue to what the thinking and evaluating in the first jhana are about. Having abandoned these five hindrances, imperfections of awareness that weaken discernment, he remains focused on the body in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, having subdued greed and distress with reference to the world. He remains focused on feelings, mind, mental qualities in and of themselves, ardent, alert, and mindful, having subdued greed and distress with reference to the world. Just as when the elephant tamer plants a large post in the ground and binds the wilderness elephant to it by the neck in order to break it of its wilderness habits, its wilderness memories and resolves, its distraction, fatigue, and fever over leaving the wilderness, to make it delight in the town and to inculcate in it habits congenial to human beings. In the same way, these four establishings of mindfulness are bindings for the awareness of the disciple of the noble ones, to break him of his household habits, his household memories and resolves, his distraction, fatigue, and fever over leaving the household life, for the attainment of the right method and the realization of unbinding. Then the Tathagata trains him further. Come, monk, remain focused on the body in and of itself, but do not think any thoughts connected with the body. Makaka yupasanyitam vitakam vitakasi. Remain focused on feelings in and of themselves, but do not think any thoughts connected with feelings. Remain focused on the mind in and of itself, but do not think any thoughts connected with mind. remain focused on mental qualities in and of themselves, but do not think any thoughts connected with mental qualities. With the stilling of vitakas and vikaras, he enters and remains in the second jhana, rapture and pleasure, born of concentration, unification of awareness, free from vitaka and vikara, internal assurance. MN 125. These instructions for entering the second jhana, to remain focused on the body, etc., in and of itself, but without thinking thoughts connected with the body, suggests that in the first jhana, one is focused on the body in and of itself, while thinking thoughts about the body. And the reason you're thinking those thoughts is so that you can delight in remaining focused on the body, just as the elephant is being taught to delight in staying in the town. This point is seconded by the image of the bathman in the standard simile for the first jhana. Of the four similes, it's the only one where a conscious agent is purposefully doing something, kneading the water through the soap powder. Water in these similes stands for pleasure, movement for rapture. The bathman apparently stands for vitaka and vikara, as they work to spread the rapture and pleasure of the first jhana throughout the body, maximizing the pleasure that can be found by staying focused with a full-body awareness. The pleasure of the first jhana is a necessary part of the concentration, not only because it makes it easier to stay concentrated, but also because it's nourishing. And 763 explicitly compares the jhanas to food for the soldiers of right effort. What's more, MN 13 makes the point that even when a monk can see the drawbacks of sensuality, if he cannot attain the pleasure of the first jhana or something higher, he won't be able to resist going back to sensuality. So this is a second reason why the practice of stilling the mind in a sense of well-being is a necessary part of the path. It strengthens your resolve not to revert to sensuality. This passage also indicates that the phrase, secluded from sensuality, in the definition of the first jhana, doesn't mean that meditators must have totally abandoned sensuality once and for all before entering the first jhana. It simply means that they've withdrawn the mind temporarily from sensual thoughts. After all, if they had totally abandoned sensuality, they'd have no need to use the pleasure of the first jhana to fortify their resistance against going back to sensuality. At first glance, it may not seem that there's much difference between the vitaka and vikara in the first jhana and the activities of metacognition described in stage 1 of the practice. After all, both involve observation and passing judgment. However, the differences are there. The first difference has to do with purpose. The activities of metacognition described in stage 1, and to be further described in stage 4, are done with the purpose of developing dispassion. Vitaka and vikara in the first jhana, though, are done not for the sake of dispassion, but for the sake of enjoyment and strengthening concentration. As for the second difference, it's not always the case that vitaka and vikara in the first jhana are limited to direct observation. This can be seen in the alternative description of vitaka and vikara in what amounts to the first jhana described in SN 47.10. That sutta notes that when you have trouble focusing on any of the standard themes for right concentration, the frames of reference for establishing mindfulness, when, in its words, a fever based on that frame of reference arises in the body, there's sluggishness in your awareness, or your mind is scattered externally, your mind should be directed panidahitabam to an inspiring theme, pasadanye nimitte. The sutta doesn't give examples to illustrate what it means by inspiring theme, but some possible candidates would include the 6 recollections described in AN 371 or the 4 sublime attitudes described in SN 42-8. None of these themes involve direct observation. Instead, they're more discursive, and yet they appear to qualify as proper objects for vitaka and vikara in the first jhana. According to SN 47.10, the purpose of thinking of these themes is to gladden the mind in a way that induces rapture, calms the body, induces pleasure, and promotes concentration. When you receive these results, you can withdraw the mind from the inspiring theme and remain mindful and at ease while engaged in no vitakka or vikara at all. Apparently, this means that you return to the frames of reference for establishing mindfulness and enter the second jhana. What's important in either case, whether you focus on observing any of the frames of reference or on thinking discursively of an inspiring theme, is that vitakka and vikara in the first jhana are focused on relating to your chosen theme of concentration in a way that induces and maximizes pleasure and rapture. This requires active thought as you make adjustments in the mind or in the object of meditation, and not mere acts of setting the mind on its object and keeping it connected there. Only when the mind and the object have been brought into harmony through thought and evaluation can vitakka and vikara have the desired effect, allowing the mind to settle down pleasurably into even deeper concentration and to ward off any further thoughts of sensuality. Stage 3. The remaining jhanas. As MN 125 notes, beginning with the second jhana, you keep track of your frame of reference, such as the breath, but without thinking thoughts about or evaluating the breath. This is where full absorption in the experience of the body, etc., begins. This apparently is what the phrase in the definition of the second jhana, kataso ekodi bhavam, unification of awareness, means. Your awareness seems to become one with its object. And these levels of jhana are apparently what Sister Vimala is referring to in one of the verses attributed to her. Today, wrapped in a double cloak, my head shaven, having wandered for alms, I sit at the foot of a tree and attain the state of no thought, avitakam. Fig 5:2. Awareness still pervades the body, as indicated by the similes for the second through fourth jhanas, but as the similes also indicate, no discursive thought is required to allow feelings of rapture or pleasure to pervade the body. There's no conscious agent spreading cool water through the lake in the simile for the second jhana. The cool water of the spring permeates the lake effortlessly. In the simile for the third, there's no motion at all, reflecting the fact that rapture has faded and the lotuses are simply saturated from their roots to their tips with cool, still water. In the simile for the fourth jhana, as in the simile for the third, everything is perfectly still. In fact, it's so still that as SN 3611 and AN 1072 indicate, in and out breathing has stopped. The lack of water in this simile symbolizes the transcending of pleasure, and all that remains is a pure, bright awareness filling the body. These similes don't describe a narrow concentration where all awareness is blotted out, and they don't describe an experience that consists simply of skillful thinking. They indicate full absorption in the sense of the body. Yet even in these states of absorption, some mental activity is going on. After all, they're fabricated and have to be maintained. MN 111 gives a detailed description of what mental activities are required to maintain absorption. This sutta describes Ven. Sariputta's special ability to get these activities ferreted out one by one, anupada vavatika, even while he was in these states of jhana. Here, it must be noted that his ability properly pertains to the fourth stage of the practice, to be discussed in the next section. But what Vinyan Sariputta was able to perceive must be present in all these states of concentration, regardless of whether you can detect them while in these states or not. The list of mental qualities falls into two parts: qualities that are present in all four of the jhanas, and those that are particular to each individual jhana. The qualities they all have in common are these: the 5 activities that are listed under name, independent co-arising, contact, feeling, perception, intention, and attention. 3 qualities that constitute right effort: desire, persistence, and intent, and then 4 qualities that do not form a standard list from elsewhere in the suttas: decision, mindfulness, equanimity, and the defining feature of concentration, singleness of mind. What's interesting in this part of the list is that the 3 qualities constituting right effort are also 3 of the bases of success, iddhipada. The 4th basis of success, discrimination, which is identical with the activity of metacognition, is missing. This is one of the indications that metacognition is not an intrinsic part of the practice of the jhanas. The qualities particular to each jhana are these. The first jhana, vitakka, vikara, rapture, pleasure. The second, internal assurance or confidence, rapture, pleasure. The third, equanimity, pleasure, mindfulness, alertness. The fourth, a feeling of equanimity, neither pleasure nor pain, unconcern due to calmness or purity of awareness. Calmness is the Burmese reading here, purity, the Thai reading. There are some anomalies in this second part of the list, especially in regard to the third jhana. Equanimity and mindfulness get listed twice, both as qualities that apply to all 4 jhanas and as qualities that apply specifically to the third. And for some reason, alertness is listed under the third, but not under the other jhanas. The important point is that the mental activities cited in both parts of the list are needed to keep the mind focused and absorbed. Those who say that, beginning with the second jhana, the mind isn't engaged in any activity at all are blind to what's actually going on. At the same time, none of these activities require discursive thinking. They can simply maintain the decision to stay absorbed in repeating the same mental acts, most prominently around the 2 activities that MN 44 lists as mental fabrication, feeling, and perception. The importance of these 2 activities is reflected in the fact that standard description of each jhana defines it by its feeling tone, and AN 936 classifies all these jhanas as perception attainments. Although staying in a particular jhana doesn't require active thought beyond the qualities included in MN 111's list, the sutta does raise the question of whether moving from one jhana to another requires a separate act of discernment. In Venjur Sariputta's case, we're told that after ferreting out the activities in each jhana, he discerned the higher escape from that jhana, and so was able to move to progressively deeper states of absorption. This discernment would be an act of metacognition. As AN 941 indicates, it could include seeing the drawbacks of whatever is the disturbing factor in the earlier state of jhana and understanding the reward of abandoning it. However, it's also possible that meditators can simply incline their minds to more and more restful states of absorption without being consciously aware of where they are on the map of the jhanas. What's important to note is that, aside from cases in which an act of discernment plays a role in progressing from a lower jhana to a higher one, none of the metacognition verbs are used to describe the practice of the jhanas in and of themselves. Stage 4. Discernment based on jhana. Of course, given that the jhanas are part of the path, they're not done in and of themselves for their own sake. They're done for the sake of a further purpose. And 441 lists 4 legitimate purposes for right concentration: as a pleasant abiding in the here and now, as a basis for psychic powers, as a basis for mindfulness and alertness, and as a basis for ending the mental effluence. The discussion in AN 441 can give the impression that it's talking about 4 different types of concentration, with the 4 jhanas mentioned explicitly for only the first purpose, as a pleasant abiding, but other passages in the suttas show that the jhanas must be understood as implicitly involved in the other 3 purposes as well. DN2, MN 39, and many other suttas that provide a map for the whole practice show that the jhanas are a basis for the psychic powers. MN 122 shows that they can provide a basis for alertness, and, of course, the standard definition of the fourth jhana shows that it's the mental state in which mindfulness becomes pure. Here we're most directly concerned with the fourth purpose, the awakening that puts an end to the mental effluence. And here again, there are many suttas showing that the discernment leading to awakening can be developed within any of the jhanas. In fact, the meditator doesn't need to leave any of the four jhanas to do the analysis required by discernment at all. Among these suttas are MN 52, MN 111, MN 140, AN 528, and AN 936. These suttas show most definitively that thinking is possible even in the higher jhanas. It's important to note, though, that this thinking is not intrinsic to any of the higher jhanas, and that it's never described as vitakka or vikara. Instead, it's described by the verbs related to metacognition. A few examples. Further, with the stilling of vitakkas and vikaras, the monk enters and remains in the second jhana. Rapture and pleasure born of concentration, unification of awareness free from vitakka and vikara, internal assurance. He reflects patisanchikati on this and discerns pajanati. This second jhana is fabricated and intended. Now whatever is fabricated and intended is inconstant and subject to cessation. Staying right there, he reaches the ending of the effluence. Or, if not, then, through this very Dhamma passion, this Dhamma delight, and from the total wasting away of the five lower fetters, self-identification views, grasping at habits and practices, uncertainty, sensual passion, and irritation, he is due to arise spontaneously in the pure abodes, there to be totally unbound, never again to return from that world. MN 52. Just as if one person were to reflect pakavakeya on another, or a standing person were to reflect on a sitting person, or a sitting person were to reflect on a person lying down. Even so, the monk who has attained the four jhanas has his theme of reflection, pakavikana, nimittam, well grasped, well attended to, well pondered, well penetrated, sugahitam, sumanasikatam, supadharitam, supatividam, by means of discernment, panyaya. This is the fifth development of the five-factored noble right concentration. And 528. Suppose that an archer or archer's apprentice were to practice on a straw man or mound of clay, so that after a while he would become able to shoot long distances, to fire accurate shots in rapid succession, and to pierce great masses. In the same way, a monk, with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, as with the earlier disappearance of joy and distress, enters and remains in the fourth jhana, purity of equanimity and mindfulness, neither pleasure nor pain. He regards samanupasati, whatever phenomena there that are connected with form, feeling, perception, fabrications, and consciousness, as inconstant, stressful, a disease, a cancer, an arrow, painful, an affliction, alien, a disintegration, an emptiness, not self. He turns, patitapeti, his mind away from those phenomena, and having done so, inclines upasamarati, his mind to the property of deathlessness. This is peace, this is exquisite, the pacification of all fabrications, the relinquishment of all acquisitions, the ending of craving, dispassion, cessation, unbinding. Staying right there, he reaches the ending of the effluence, or, if not, then, through this very Dhamma passion, this Dhamma delight, and from the total ending of the five lower fetters, self-identification views, grasping at habits and practices, uncertainty, sensual passion, and irritation, he is due to arise spontaneously in the pure abodes, there to be totally unbound, never again to return from that world. And 936. As with the metacognition described in stage 1, The acts of metacognition described here involve stepping back from one state of mind and observing, reflecting, regarding, discerning it with the purpose of developing dispassion for it, turning the mind away from it and inclining it elsewhere. The simile in AN 528 of the sitting person reflecting on the person lying down, etc., gives an especially clear image of the need to step back from what your mind is doing in order to engage in this type of metacognition. The main difference between the metacognition employed during the first stage of the practice and that employed in the fourth stage is that here it's aimed not at clearing the ground for jhana practice, but at developing dispassion for jhana itself, and, by implication, for all other fabricated mental states as well. As we noted when discussing the mental activities employed in all states of jhana in stage 3 of the practice, the component activities of all the jhanas include all the factors of name-independent co-arising. These are the factors that provide a basis for the craving that leads to further becoming, the second noble truth. So, when acts of metacognition can develop dispassion for these factors, it attacks the problem of suffering, the first noble truth, at the causes of its cause. The component factors present in all the jhanas also include right mindfulness, the elements of right effort, and concentration itself. This means that when dispassion can be developed for these factors, it allows the mind to let go of its last attachment to the path, the fourth noble truth itself. So here we see a third reason for getting the mind into a state of stillness with no vitakka or vikara. It provides you with a background of stillness that allows you to ferret out the mental events that can lead to suffering and instead to abandon them with finesse. Without that stillness, those events would remain hidden to you in a confusing blur of mental activity. Just right. When we see how the practice of meditation falls into 4 stages, and the care with which the Buddha described the types of thinking appropriate to each, we can understand why the answer to the question, how much thinking is just right in the practice of concentration, is not a simple one. Instead, it depends on 3 things. Yach, which stage of the practice you're in, what kind of thinking is appropriate to that stage, or what its purpose is. In the first stage, prior to jhana, you engage in enough skillful vitakka and vikara to counteract any unskillful thoughts, and in enough metacognition to see the drawbacks of unskillful thinking, the relative merits of skillful thinking, and the need for the mind to rest, even from skillful thinking by entering concentration. In the second stage, the first jhana, you engage in enough vitakka and vikara focused on the theme of your concentration to maximize the pleasure and rapture you can gain from staying with that theme, and to spread that pleasure and rapture throughout the body. In the third stage, the remaining jhanas, you engage in just enough mental activity, devoid of vitakka and vikara, to maintain the focus of your concentration. You might engage in metacognition only to the extent of discerning a drawback of a lower jhana and moving the mind to a higher one, but even that much metacognition is not always required. In the fourth stage, building on the practice of the jhanas, you engage in enough metacognition to see the drawbacks of the jhanas and, by extension, all fabricated phenomena. This metacognition is what leads to the noble attainments and ultimately to release from all suffering and stress. 2 practical considerations flow from this answer to our original question. The first is that people who tend to think too little tend to dislike thinking. This is why they have to put extra effort into engaging in metacognition in the fourth stage, and not just to rest in the jhanas in the second and third stage. Otherwise, they'll never reach any of the noble attainments. Conversely, people who think too much tend to like thinking, which is why they have to be encouraged to engage in the sort of metacognition that sees the advantages that come from allowing the mind to stop thinking, to allow it to rest, to strengthen its resolve against sensuality, and to clarify the mental activities of name and the path so that they can deepen their dispassion for them. The second practical consideration is that just as thinking needs to be just right in order to get the best results from the meditation, concentration needs to be just right as well. If your concentration is devoted totally to thinking, it'll never yield the results that come from allowing the mind to be still. If it's so narrowly focused that it allows no room for thinking at all, it'll never allow for the sort of metacognition that's needed to lead the mind to the deathless. So, just as the Buddha's path to the end of suffering follows a middle way in general, his teachings on the practice of right concentration teach a middle way too. Of course, the middle here is not simply a matter of finding a halfway point between two extremes. It requires that you be sensitive to where you are in the practice and to the task at hand. In other words, for concentration to be right, it has to be just right for what's needed right now.